Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Deb Otis, the Director of Policy and Research at FairVote. Deb, welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Thanks so much for having me today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation. We've been exploring the question of the functioning of American democracy in various capacities and have already done one deep dive on election reform itself. But I know that you all have been working on this for quite some time and have some different points of view, and I'm excited to kind of unpack that. So maybe the best place to start is tell us about FairVote, what it is, and what you all are up to.
Absolutely. FairVote is a nonprofit organization. We work on election reform. So our key reform priorities are ranked choice voting and proportional representation. Our org has been operating for 32 years, and we have seen these reforms grow in popularity. And we've seen the number of adoptions grow over that time. And we are really excited for the moment we're in, where there's more and more attention on these types of reforms that can really make a difference in our politics.
Yeah, I want to get to the mechanics of both of those reforms because I think they're interesting. But before we do that, I want to just take a step back and zoom out and get your perspective, and maybe FairVote's perspective on what the problem is. Like what about our current setup in terms of election mechanics and laws is not working, and what are some of the implications of it?
We have a number of issues in our elections and our politics that are really frustrating for voters. A recent poll this week finds 2/3 of respondents are unhappy with the way democracy is going in this country. We have frustrations with it's hard to participate in elections. We often elect candidates without majority support. This means in crowded fields, we sometimes elect a candidate with only 30% of the votes, meaning 70% voted for somebody else. We have a gerrymandering problem. We are divided into safe districts and swing districts, safe states and swing states, where voters in some geographic areas matter a lot more than voters in others. Many of us feel like our votes don't matter, and we are frustrated with the tone of politics. Politics has become so polarized and so negative. It's not good for voters when the campaigns just devolve into these mudslinging battles instead of being able to focus on issues and connect with voters. That's a long list of issues that folks have with our elections. In order to fix these, we need to look at structural issues. We need to look beyond just any one candidate. It's great to work on a candidate campaign and get someone you believe in elected into office. But even if you get your perfect candidate elected, we are still being held back by some of the mechanics of our election systems that put the wrong incentives in place.
Yeah. What's so interesting about this topic is I did a bunch of episodes on the podcast about housing policy because, my day job, I'm in the real estate business and I've done a lot of civic activist work myself in LA, trying to encourage development. And what was interesting about talking with folks who've been in the trenches of that world for like the last decade, let's say, which there's been some wins, like the YIMBY movement is like a win in jurisdictions like where I live here in California. But they all kind of came to a negative conclusion that without some kind of systemic reform in the election process, that the housing movement, the pro-housing movement is going to stall out. And it goes to what you were just describing in that eloquent description of kind of the problem statement. Like, if we don't change the way in which people get elected, we're still going to have the same kind of dynamics playing out on the policy standpoint, at least.
I think that's true. I think that's true for the housing movement. I think that's also true for other issue coalitions, not people that are necessarily one party or another, but are kind of organized around a specific issue. I think environmental issues is another one like housing that plenty of voters care about. It can cross party lines or it can be party neutral, but many voters see that as their second or third most important issue. When they're choosing a candidate, they care about that, but it's not the thing they care about most. And it can be really hard to get representation for those types of issues and get politicians that will be responsive to their constituents on that.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing that's interesting about this, the landscape as it stands today, and we I talked to Nick Troiano from Unite America quite a bit about this. There's a huge chunk of American elections, at least for Congress, that are completely uncompetitive. Basically, like the primary is where the election is fought, like whoever wins the Democrat or Republican primary, and then the general election's like a joke. And that's true where I live for sure. California has that dynamic played out where, Republicans make it into these statewide elections and they get destroyed. It's not even close. Like the people who run on the Democrat side don't even have to spend any money after they get out of the primary.
That's absolutely right. At FairVote, we have been doing a project called Monopoly Politics for 25 years, where the week after a congressional election, we project the winners of the next congressional election. So 2 years out, we don't even know who's running. We don't know what the issues are going to be. We don't know what the mood of the country will be, but we can tell you 90% of the seats. We can say the Republican's winning that one. There's no question. The Democrat is winning that one. No question. Before one election season is even over, we can project the next one. And that's not how it should be. Elections should matter. Voters should be able to have the say rather than being drawn into these safe districts where the outcome is a foregone conclusion.
Yeah. What a world. It seems like obviously the gerrymandering thing has been a problem since the beginning, right? Like wasn't Elbridge Gerry like one of the founders or close to the founders? Like he was there at the beginning and he started doing this, right?
Yes. And the courts have decided that, at least for partisan gerrymandering, it's a feature of the system, not a bug. Partisan gerrymandering is a good thing. I think it's not great for voters. It's not great for making a responsive government, but it is built into our system.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into the mechanics stuff, I wanted to get your take on sort of just like the other potential problems in the system, because I do think that the hypothesis of FairVote and groups like Unite America is they're onto something. You guys are onto something. Like there's something wrong with the mechanics of the way we're doing elections. But I also think that technology is having, and culture is also having, a huge impact. What is your take on that? Like the decline of trust in media and the rise of addictive social media technologies. Do you think if you got rid of those, that could make a difference? Or if you had some kind of regulatory reform that could change things? Or do you got to change the election process no matter what?
I think any one of these changes is one piece of the solution. I wish I could pitch you on like the one silver bullet that's fixing everything. Unfortunately, I can't do that. I think a lot of these reforms work best when they are paired with other reforms. This reform solves these 3 problems, but it doesn't address these other 8. And so I do think it's good to be approaching this from a lot of different directions. And I think we are starting to, as a society, we're starting to think about this the right way, that we need to fix these systems.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it now. So you've got two big ideas at FairVote. Have these always, by the way, I didn't realize until this morning when I was reading through the website, I didn't realize that FairVote had been around for so long. And it's really cool. Have these always been the 2 focus areas, this ranked choice voting and the proportional representation?
These were always a big part of it, but it's only recently that we really narrowed to just these 2. In earlier work over previous decades, we worked on a lot more issues. Like we've been involved in Electoral College work in the past, and now we have determined that we can have the most impact by doing just these 2 issues, because we're seeing them where they're being adopted in practice. It is working, and it's working well. And so this is it's a good time to put our eggs in this basket.
Okay. Got it. All right. So let's go through ranked choice voting. What's that? And how does it work?
Ranked choice voting is a simple change on the ballots, but it has some pretty powerful impacts. So it just means voters get to rank the candidates on their ballot instead of picking just one. So when you're going in to vote, you get to pick your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice, and so on if it's a crowded field. And this means for voters, we are freed from strategic voting. Right now, a lot of voters have to do the math when going to vote. There's a lot of talk about spoiler candidates or wasted votes. If you vote for this candidate, are you really only helping to elect the candidate you like least? It's a very tricky situation to put voters in. Ranked choice voting frees us from that. I will go ahead and use the current presidential election as a good example of how this can be powerful. We have two candidates from the major parties, of course, but we also have a number of independent and third-party candidates running. One of those, RFK Jr., is polling well above 5%, including in a lot of swing states. And so is the presidential election going to come down to how many voters voted for RFK Jr. in 3 swing states? It could. It really could. And so you see this narrative about whether it's okay to vote for an independent or third party, or whether you have to just pick the Republican or the Democrat and call it a day. There are 2 states that already use ranked choice voting for their presidential elections. That is Maine and Alaska. And so those voters don't have to do the math. If your honest first choice is one of these third party or independent candidates, rank them first. And then you get backup choices. You get to rank the other candidates in order of preference. So those of us living in 48 states and DC are going to have to do the math in November. Voters in Alaska and Maine just get to rank their honest preferences and not worry about spoiling the election or wasting their votes.
I see. And so in this, using this example, let's say you live in Maine and your first choice is RFK and your second choice is Harris. You vote RFK 1 and you put Harris as 2. And then if RFK doesn't get a majority, that first vote basically just gets thrown away and your second vote counts. Is that how it works?
After they count up just first choices, they check if anybody has a majority. And so, it's possible in Maine, maybe one of the candidates will have over 50% of first choices. If so, they win outright. But if not, and one of Maine's congressional districts is really competitive, so it's likely there won't be a majority. If there's no majority, then you go into what's called an instant runoff. And now this all just happens in the second it's a push of a button. Voters are not, having to vote again. You already ranked on your ballot who's your second choice if it goes into runoff. So if there's no majority winner, you eliminate the last place candidate. If we assume maybe that was RFK Jr. and that's who you voted for, then your ballot counts for your second choice in the next round. So your vote stays in play. It's like having the opportunity to go back and vote in a runoff, but you don't have to show up a second time.
Yeah, so it's more efficient and you can do it instantaneously, essentially.
Absolutely. I think it's better for the tone of the campaign as well. We look to Georgia runoffs. They've had some high profile runoffs. They happen in December, a few weeks after the rest of us have voted, and millions of negative advertising dollars pour into Georgia over those couple of weeks. And that's not great for anybody. That's not how our money should be spent. It's not good for voters. Doing an instant runoff, doing ranked choice voting can be more efficient for everybody.
Yeah. And in these 2 states where they're doing it, are they doing it for every election or just the presidential?
Most elections. So in Alaska and Maine, they're doing this for, their state legislature, their U.S. Congress, their governor and president. They are not using it for local municipal elections in those states, but individual cities and towns can choose to opt in and adopt it if they want to. A couple of places in Maine have done that. And so they get ranked choice for everything.
Okay, got it. It strikes me, just thinking about it right now out loud, that if there's a criticism of ranked choice voting, it's that maybe it's going to be confusing to people. What do you say to that?
I would say that our current system is confusing to people. We talked about this strategic voting. Think back to presidential primaries. Whichever party whose primaries you vote in, we tend to get really crowded fields, especially when there's an open seat. And, voters are looking at 12 candidates and you're thinking, well, I like all 3 of these. I'd be okay with these 3, but I hate these 4. And how do you express all of that when you can only fill in one bubble? That is what's confusing. Let voters rank honestly, and you are free from all of that. And so, we look at in places that have already adopted ranked choice voting, voters say that they like it and they understand it. They want to keep it. And so once it's in place, voters like it and they don't want to go back. I think maybe the first time someone hears about it, they say, oh, this does sound new and different. But then once thinking it through, they go, oh, this would be much better and much easier.
Yeah. What do the detractors say? First of all, who are the detractors and what do they say?
Detractors tend to be folks who are benefiting from the status quo. So folks that have won elections without majority support, or sometimes current elected officials. They know how to win under the old system, so they're maybe least likely to change the system. However, we've seen once the system is changed, then elected officials tend to support it as well and even expand it. We've seen this in places like Maine. Ranked choice voting first came there through a ballot measure. So the voters voted to adopt it. But since then, the state legislature has expanded it or protected it multiple times over several years. And so we see once it's in place, even elected officials love it. And so I think the detractors tend to be folks that are happy with the way things are working. But that's a small number of folks. As we've seen from surveys, we talked about 66% of people being unhappy with politics in the US. That is our majority in support of reform.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in Troiano's book, he cites a similar statistic about the sort of job satisfaction polling around Congress in particular. And it was really high. Like I believe it was maybe in the 80s, like 80% of people think Congress is doing a bad job or something like that. But the same people basically keep getting elected over and over again to Congress. Yeah.
Well, it's this interesting paradox. Everyone will tell you they like their own congressperson, but they hate Congress. And so that's a structural problem.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe that's a function of the other focus area, which is proportional, the other idea that you all are pushing, the proportional representation. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. That is a reform that goes one step further. So I will use the city of Portland, Oregon as an example to explain how this is going to work. They have adopted a form of proportional representation for their municipal elections. They will be using it for the first time this November, just a few months from now. And so most of our cities elect our city councilors either all citywide or from single-member districts. Some of our cities are carved into 8 districts or 8 wards, and we elect one person from each. What Portland is doing is they have 4 districts. All of the city councilors are coming from districts, but you got 3 people coming from each district. 3 people each from 4 districts is a total of 12. And so what does this mean? These people within the districts, these 3, are elected using proportional ranked choice voting. So it's still ranking. You still rank your candidates in order of preference, but we're electing 3 instead of 1. And this means the threshold for victory is lower. The threshold for victory there is not 50% anymore. It is 25%. And so every group who controls 25% of the vote can get one of those seats. And so this is how you get multi-party democracy and multiracial democracy. This is how you get fair representation for issue coalitions. Instead of taking a district and saying, I don't care how much diversity of thought there is within this district, we're only going to elect one person. We're going to elect one opinion from this district. You say, well, let's have a table that has 3 seats at it, and let's reflect, the 3 biggest groups here. And maybe there, in some of these districts, there might be, one really predominant group. Portland, Oregon's a pretty left-leaning city. And so, I expect multiple Democrats, multiple left-leaning candidates to come out of each of these districts, but they can be people who kind of reflect maybe different neighborhoods within their district or different sides of the Democratic Party. And this is the way that you get to a more reflective democracy. And so, FairVote has been working on federal legislation called the Fair Representation Act that would do this for Congress. And I think Portland, Oregon is a great example to watch starting in November for how this works in practice.
And the Fair Representation Act would apply that principle to everyone in the House of Reps, right? So like California has X many numbers of reps, and rather than being elected district by district, they would be elected statewide. Is that how it works?
They would still be elected from districts, but they'd be bigger districts that elect 5 people each. And so each one of them the district gets geographically bigger. And, if you were elected to represent that district, you would have other representatives from the same district. So you would share some constituents. I think this creates some really nice dynamics where, in a 5-member district, you likely get at least 1, probably 2 members of both parties. And they will occasionally have incentive to work together because they are representing the same area and the same people. It doesn't mean they're going to be best friends, but they will have each other's number to work together on some things. And that starts breaking down barriers that we're just not able to do right now.
Yeah. And how did you all come up with the sizing for these districts?
This is based on a lot of political science research from before FairVote has existed and since then as well, showing that that's a good sweet spot for proportionality. If you have 5 people representing a district, you're getting pretty proportional results, but it's not too many. If we went up to 10 or 12 people, that's just too many candidates and too many elected officials for voters to keep track of. So it's like a balance between how proportional do you want it to be, and how convenient, how accessible should this be to voters. And so a lot of research suggests that that's a good sweet spot.
Yeah. And in the Fair Representation Act, like, where does that sit now procedurally? Has that been put forward by anybody, or is that just something you all are pushing? What's the status?
This is a bill that is active in Congress this session. Its lead sponsor is Don Beyer from Virginia. We are hoping to build more support, gain more supporters for that bill. It has not had a committee hearing, and it does not have support yet from a majority of members of the House of Representatives. But we do think there is something in here that is good for everybody. We think that both parties can benefit from this. And so I think the future is bright for this legislation, even if it takes a couple of cycles.
Yeah, for sure. And there's another one that's also maybe in the same position that was for the primary reform, right? What's the name of that one? I'm forgetting the name of it, but.
Oh no, I'm also drawing a blank on the name of this. There is a more recent bill that would ensure that voters can participate in primary elections regardless of whether they're registered with a political party.
Yeah, I forget the name of it, but I'll make sure we put it in the show notes. But it was sort of what Unite America, what Nick Troiano and his colleagues at Unite America were hoping for, to get it all done at once. They've been successful getting open primaries done on state-by-state basis and making some progress on that, but this would just do it all at once, is my understanding of it.
Yeah, and we're on board with, of course, ensuring that independent voters have the opportunity to participate in primary elections. We've changed our systems of elections a lot over the years, but now primaries are government funded. They tend to be state funded, and it just makes no sense to exclude a certain class of people from those.
Yeah. Do you think you need primary reform in order to fix it all, or would the combination of the two reforms that we just went through, would that be enough, or do you need what Nick and his colleagues are pushing for?
I think the best solution is always going to be a mix of solutions. And so I think ranked choice voting and primary reform are natural allies. Primary reform, letting more people participate, letting elections be more competitive, and then ranked choice voting to help voters better decide among this competitive field. I think the Alaska model of elections is one that is gaining more interest. It combines these two reforms, and it does so well.
Yeah. Another question I've been thinking about a lot, I want to get your take on is, on X and other social media platforms, there's like a lot of chatter about voter registration and the potential for voter registration fraud, and various degrees of conspiracy theories on one way or the other. And my understanding is every state is essentially an opt-in system, right? Like, if you want to vote, you got to go and actively register to vote, and you're responsible for maintaining your address and whatnot. Is that an accurate understanding?
No. One of the newer developments is a lot of states, it's opt out. So a number of places have what's called automatic voter registration, which means if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get a driver's license, they're registering you to vote as well. If you're interacting with this government agency, they're also putting you on the voter rolls to make it easier for you to participate in elections. And you would effectively have to opt out at that point and say, no, I don't want to be registered to vote. I think that's a good development. I think that's exactly the kind of efficiency that we want to see from our government agencies.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so in those places, like, how many places are doing the opt-out version?
I would have to look that up and get back to you on the number of states, but I do know it's gaining in popularity.
It's gaining. And do you think that there's anything behind the conspiracy theories around voter registration fraud?
I have not seen any evidence that has been persuasive to me that this is happening in a widespread way. I want to remain open-minded, of course, to any new evidence that comes in, but I have yet to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, like there's even crazy stuff, right? Circulating online, like people saw in the Georgia elections, for example, people show up to these ballot boxes with like gigantic packages of ballots that they're putting in, and who knows whether these videos are true or not. Like it's really difficult as a concerned citizen to make heads or tails of it, but it sounds like the research on the research side, no one's really seeing that.
Right. I will add from my time doing this work on elections, I've been lucky enough to get to engage with a lot of election workers, election administrators, and I have a lot of faith in these folks who are running our elections. And so there are a lot of safeguards in place. I would encourage anyone with these kinds of questions to go on a tour of the ballot processing facility. A lot of state elections departments offer one of these tours, and they'll show you what happens to a ballot when it comes in through the mail or when someone votes in person. What do we do with that? How do we maintain voter anonymity while also checking that they are a registered voter? And so I've seen such good work from our election administrators, who are generally an overworked bunch, that I think they're doing a very good job of keeping our elections secure and accurate.
Yeah. Interesting. That I might actually take you up on that and go check out the local office here. That would be a cool study. What do you think of term limits? Like another reform that I've seen bandied about with respect to Congress in particular, because of the extreme levels of dissatisfaction, of saying like, wait, maybe we should have term limits. And obviously, but President Biden just floated the idea of term limits on the Supreme Court, or not term. Yeah, I guess it's kind of term limits on the Supreme Court, the 18-year threshold. What's your take on that?
I don't know. I am undecided on this one. I hear arguments both for and against term limits on Congress. In favor of term limits, the idea of some turnover and preventing these folks from being really entrenched for decades seems healthy. But on the con side, there are questions about then what lawmaking might look like if you have this constant turnover and you don't kind of develop this institutional understanding of how things actually get done. And so I am undecided on that one. As I said, I want to keep an open mind. I'm willing to be persuaded. Where are you on term limits?
Intellectually, it seems like the right move, because you get these entrenched interests. From my state, you have people serve for decades, in the Senate and in the Congress, and then many times someone will be in Congress for decades, and then a Senate seat will open up, and they'll win the Senate seat. So, like basically, like no, there's no room for anyone else. And I had written a policy article about this a while ago. Like, to me, I feel like the way to fix it maybe would be to simultaneously introduce term limits and then dramatically increase the salary. So, like, rather than House of Reps members making whatever they make, 200,000 or something, make it $1 million. And I know people might get pissed at that, but the idea of it is, make it so that the best and brightest who could go make $1 million in the private sector are like, okay, that's interesting now. Financially, that's interesting to me, because it's a very difficult job. Like, I have one friend in Congress now, and it's tough. You're constantly fundraising. You have so many different masters, and your seat's, potentially threatened if you're in one of the few districts that there's actually a threat. And it's a very demanding job, and you're not getting paid near as much as you could get paid in the private sector. So I think a combination of the two could be interesting.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Same with the Senate. Like, make the Senate like $5 million a year. Make it like the equivalent.
Well, today's the day I announce my candidacy for Senate.
Yes, people would, because then it would bring a different energy to the whole thing. But you'd have to couple that. If you jack the salaries up, you'd have to have term limits, because you don't want to just like hand out millions of dollars to people who are going to automatically win every election. You want to make it that.
Yeah.
But that another question I had for you all is, what do you think about the campaign finance side of this? I feel like that's another area that you had high profile political leaders talking about. Like, when I sort of came of age, like McCain was talking about it, and Al Gore was talking about it, and even former President Bush was talking about it to an extent, about, man, the influence of this money on the system is a problem, and we need to make some changes. What is your take on that?
I agree that some changes there would be really helpful. You know, it's not an area that FairVote works on specifically, but our mission is to improve elections and make elections better for the voters. And right now we're in a situation where elections are pretty good for the money, but not necessarily for individual voters. Yeah, I think those are other reforms that pair really well together. So if you're doing primaries reform or ranked choice voting reform, it goes great with some campaign finance reform as well. We saw Alaska do that when they passed their open primaries plus ranked choice voting. It also included a campaign finance provision in that same ballot measure. And so it's a great example of combining a few reforms to get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, and now that the Alaska system, we talked with Troiano about that a little bit, but it's been in place for some time now. Is there noticeable from a policy research standpoint? Is there noticeable differences in the political environment up there?
We did see victories for more moderate or centrist candidates in the places where ranked choice voting seems to make the difference, where it determined who won. It was the more moderate candidate who prevailed rather than the more extreme candidate. And we do, you know, their state Senate there, instead of having a Republican coalition or caucus and a Democratic caucus, their governing coalition is a bipartisan coalition made up of 17 out of 20 of their state senators, where these folks got together and said, we can all work together to make the best policy when we're all in the room. And so we don't need to go back to our separate Republican room and Democratic room. We can be in this room together. And that is, I think, a unique feature of Alaskan politics. Now, they have had senates with this same sort of bipartisan coalition, even before they adopted ranked choice voting. But a lot of the leaders of those coalitions were slowly getting primaried out of office. And so I think that was on its way out, as a lot of the folks who were willing to cross the aisle and work together had started losing office. They started losing to more extreme primary challengers. Ranked choice voting brought some of those people back into office, and it changed the incentives for how people should campaign and govern.
Yeah, it's kind of encouraging. Seems like these reforms and like you've said several times, combination of these could actually move the needle in a good direction for like the average American. Maybe the
Absolutely.
corporate overlords might be upset about some of this, but it'd be good for Americans.
For sure.
What's your take on the various discussions around the Electoral College?
FairVote has worked previously on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Since we want elections to reflect the will of the voters, we have supported National Popular Vote in the past. We think it works really well with ranked choice voting as well. If we ever were to move to a national popular vote, it would be crucially important that that national popular vote be able to deliver a majority winner. I think my biggest problem with the Electoral College right now is not that, you know, some states, their vote, like some states have outsized representation. My problem is some states are swing states and most states are safe states. When you look at the money spent in presidential elections and the visits where candidates go to visit, it's all in the same 6 or 8 states every cycle, and everyone else is ignored. And that is not how decisions should be made. It shouldn't be just the people in those 6 swing states. You know, California and Texas are huge states, but they have no electoral power until one of them turns purple.
Yep. I know. Like the candidates, they spend some time here because they need to fundraise here because there's, you know, a lot of wealth in California and Texas. And so they do go to these places, but I'm sure, like, I've never lived in a swing state as a voter. I grew up in Michigan, which has now become a swing state, and probably was a swing state back then. But I'm sure it's wild this season. It's probably wild in Michigan as far as the number of events, number of things on television. Yeah.
And you kind of even hear horror stories sometimes from voters in like the early primary states. They're like, I'm getting called way too often.
Yeah.
I think we do need to level the playing field between the states a little bit so that issues from everywhere matter.
Yeah. And we've had several times now, right? I forget the elections, but there's been several times where the candidate who won the popular vote did not win the presidency. right?
That has happened twice just since 2000. Yes.
Yeah.
I think as our elections become so nationalized, our presidential elections will continue to be really close elections. And so the likelihood of that happening is more common now than it was in the 1800s or the 1900s.
Yeah. You obviously have done a lot of research and keep track of all this stuff. I wanted to ask you, like, one of the things that's been bothering me since I've become a citizen, actually, like a voting citizen. I guess I've always been a citizen of America, but a voting citizen, is it strikes me that there's a very large percentage of the population that actually doesn't even know what they're doing when it comes to the ballot box. And they vote. They may have like an emotional or a familial tie to a political party, for example, but they don't really know what they're doing. And when you get down to local elections, this is particularly true. Like, people don't even have the slightest clue who their city council representatives are, or in many cases, their House of Reps. Like, what are you seeing on that? What does the research say? Is my anecdotal experience with that reflective of a broader truth, or is there a more optimistic story out there?
Well, I tend to be an optimist about this kind of stuff, so I might take the opposite position here. I think campaigns and the news media sometimes treat voters as though they're stupid and don't know what they're doing, and I think that's not really true. I think there are a lot of voters out there who maybe they disagree with me, and I don't understand the choices that they make, but they still have good reasons for making those choices. It's just that their priorities are different than mine. We do have a lot of people in this country who are just disaffected, not paying attention to politics at all. Those tend to be the non-voters. I would love to find ways to engage totally disengaged citizens, people who aren't voting and aren't paying attention at all. I think the people that are showing up to vote tend to have an idea of what they're looking for and what they want. They just might have a lot of different sets of priorities. In municipal elections, city council, for example, turnout is just so low. I think one big way to help that would be to get rid of these odd year elections. You know, a lot of cities are holding their elections in 2021 and 2023 instead of holding them on the even years so they could coincide with the high turnout federal elections. So that would be one quick fix. I think if people have their city council on their ballot at the same time as president, they'll spend 5 minutes Googling and understand what the issues are and be able to make an educated vote. I think asking them to show up in March of an odd numbered year is just a recipe for low turnout. No wonder we have that problem.
Yeah, that was true here in Los Angeles until recently. They switched it, and it's having a noticeable impact on turnout and maybe even the dynamic of the election itself. Like, different types of candidates have been winning since they put it on cycle. And there's been several articles kind of written about that. But I think like several years ago, maybe like 8 years ago, former Mayor Eric Garcetti won mayor with like a few 100,000 votes. I think it was like less than 500,000 votes. And the city is 4 million people or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's hardly a mandate.
Yeah. I saw the chart on your all website, and it basically was like charting the voter turnout in presidential elections. And America's not that bad, right? Like, it's like 150 million people out of 330. But my question was, I couldn't find it in the data. How many of the 330 million people are actually sort of old enough to vote or able to vote based upon their, citizenship status?
When you look at voting age population, that tends to be like 75% to 80% of the total population. So it's not everybody, but still a good chunk are eligible. Yeah.
Okay. So that number, like we were to get the non-voters who you mentioned just a few minutes ago, like, that number would be pretty large. That would be what, like 20, 30 million additional voters?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that could make it.
Primary reason, people are doing surveys all the time. Like, why are so many people not participating? The key reasons they give are, I don't feel like my vote would matter if I voted, or I don't like any of the candidates. And those are fixable. We can fix those problems.
Totally. This is so fascinating. Deb, how did you get interested in this field of work? Curious.
I first started working on election reform as a volunteer. I was living in Massachusetts at the time, and I got involved with a local campaign for ranked choice voting. Just, in my evenings and weekends. I had a day job. I came from the private sector before this. Background as a data analyst. But I got really captivated by doing this election reform work because it felt to me like it could have a bigger impact. I had previously volunteered for candidate campaigns. And even when you win, it's great. And then a lot of the structural problems are still there, even though you've helped elect someone you believe in. And so once I started working on this structural reform, it was like my eyes opened up. Once you start seeing things through this lens, it's hard to see things in any other way. And so a couple of years after starting that volunteer work, I kind of made the career change and started full-time at FairVote. I've been here for about 4 years now. It's been great.
Nice. And then were you always like politically inclined, in your younger days?
Yeah. I hadn't done it professionally until coming to FairVote, but it was always an interest. I was always pretty tuned in.
Okay. Very cool. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show. This is and sharing about the work that you all are doing. I'm excited about the potential. I really like this proportional idea. I think the ranked choice voting makes sense too. Like, it's not that I don't like that, but to me, like, this gerrymandering stuff is a real problem. And if we could address that, and that's an intelligent way to address it, it actually would make a big difference in many places. Because you look at these maps, they're absurd, and it doesn't even make any sense. It's never made any sense for the last 200 something years. It's been that problem. And so we probably should address that one.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. FairVote has sample maps for what every state could look like under the Fair Representation Act. So people can go and look up their own state. Nick, you can find California or all the other states on there. So fairvote.org, you'll find sample maps that are kind of fun to peruse.
Awesome. Well, before we go, is there anything else you would like the audience to know about FairVote, or ways it can help, or any details that I missed in this conversation?
Well, I would just leave folks with a brief call to action. It is so much fun to do podcasts and to talk about the ways that our elections could be fixed. We also have the opportunity to go out and actually do it. So look up a local organization in your area that is working on election reforms. These groups exist at the city level and at the state level. They would love to hear from you. Show up to a Zoom, show up to a meeting, get on a phone call, and figure out what you can do to help.
Amazing. Perfect way to end this. Deb, thank you so much for being here, and look forward to keeping track of your great work.
Thank you. This has been great.